together. Santina, I can see that people are still sort of coming in pretty quickly. Are you happy if we just give it a couple more minutes?
Yeah, all good, all good.
Okay, fantastic. In the meantime, whoa, so many people. Okay, great. Got 3-4 teacher, another teacher from New Zealand. Oh, more. So many people from New Zealand. This is great. Learning support, someone from prep. Brilliant, more learning support. Oh, this is fantastic. Looks like I've got a really diverse range of people here. Some people from Queensland as well. Welcome, everyone. This is great. If at any point anyone is having trouble getting into the webinar, or you're chatting to your colleagues and they can't get in, feel free to just shoot them to the online learning email address at MTA. I'm not sure, Rachel, if you're manning the chat, if you just want to pop in a little blurb, perhaps just saying if anyone has colleagues who can't find the link, or perhaps I'm not sure if they're able to copy the link from here, just so they can sort of pass it over to people. Okay, it's 4:32, and I know we said we would start at 4:30, so I'm going to kick off because I know everyone's had a really long day, especially people in New Zealand, and so let's make sure that we can jump in, do a little bit of learning, but then let's all get out of here by 5 p.m. So welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Rosemary Arnott. I am not presenting today, but I'm just making a little introduction. I am from Modern Teaching Aids. I'm a digital learning manager, and today we have a special guest presenting our webinar today. So we have Santina DeMauro. She's a literacy consultant and trainer with Jolly Phonics, and we're lucky because we have 30 years teaching experience with Santina. We've got experience in the classroom. She has experience as a literacy consultant in diverse schools all across the country, and she also works and has worked for years and years as a teacher trainer in Australia, in the UK, and in Asia. So we are incredibly lucky to have her here. As I said before, we have over 80 registrations for this webinar, which I think just indicates how many teachers there are out there who are looking for information all about phonics, especially with this changing curriculum that's happened recently. So it's great to have everyone here. What we're going to do in terms of questions is we're just going to let Santina go through her presentation for about 20 or 25 minutes. And then when she's done, we'll open up the floor for questions, just so she has a chance to keep her train of thought. And then at the end, we'll have a good sort of 5 or 10 minutes just dedicated to teacher questions. So if you guys think of anything, hang on to it in your head. If you have an absolute burning question, pop it into the chat. But Rachel will probably just type a response in the chat. But Santina, you just go for it. And then when you're finished, we will have some questions. But over to you, Santina.
Thank you. And wow, what a great turnout, which is absolutely wonderful. In particular with change, because there's so much change that is currently happening within our curriculum. It's just we're in a state of, for some of us, in the unknown, because we don't really understand the full complexity of phonics and blending and segmenting. A lot of questions that I get from teachers in particular regarding blending and segmenting is that, they've taught phonics, the kids know their phonemes to graphemes, but they just are struggling with blending and segmenting. Where do I go from here to help them with the reading and the writing process? So blending and segmenting is something that for many of us, as I said, is very unknown. And when I first started teaching, and phonics has always been around for me, most of my experience with teaching has been with children with English as a second language. So phonics has always been key. The methodology of phonics has always been that question. I wasn't sure, I didn't know that there were different methods of the teaching of phonics, but blending and segmenting in particular, I always thought that once you taught phonics, the kids should be able to blend and segment, and I was very wrong. So I was on a learning journey myself over the many years of trying to teach children how to read and write through phonics, and realised that I needed to teach blending and segmenting. I needed to really explicitly teach that whole concept of blending and segmenting. So let's go through. I'm going to go through some terminology first. And I'd like to have a look at what we mean by synthetic phonics. So I talked about that methodology of phonics because when I first started teaching phonics, I always thought phonics was phonics. I'm teaching letter sounds at that stage in my early career. So I started teaching in the 80s. And for me, phonics was a sound a week. I did a lot of craft work with phonics. It was predominantly letter names. Yes, the sound, the phoneme came in, but it was predominantly teaching the kids the names of letters. And it was the methodology that when I was on this journey of working out how best to teach kids how to read and write, that synthetic phonics really came about, and understanding that there are different methods of teaching phonics. So have a look at synthetic phonics, look at blending, segmenting, and then this concept of decoding, because a lot of interchange here with blending and decoding. So what is that fine line between that blending and that decoding? So let's have a look at synthetic phonics first. Synthetic phonics is that part to whole approach to reading. So when I think about the parts are down here, and they're all the phonemes and the graphemes, and then we build to the whole word. So we start with our knowledge of the phonemes and the graphemes. We start to blend in order to create that whole word, to read that whole word, as well as that concept of segmenting, being able to pull a word apart to be able to record it and to spell it. So a part to whole approach to reading, which is very different to what's been in our curriculum worldwide, not just in Australia, not just in New Zealand, but worldwide, where we have been doing the opposite type of phonics, which we know as analytic phonics. And that was a start of giving children lists and lists of words to learn by sight. So this is quite different for us, where we start with phonics of teaching kids the phonemes to the graphemes and teaching them the process skills. And that's what I refer to blending and segmenting. They're the process skills of using phonics. I treat synthetic phonics very similar to the way we teach mathematics. And I've always said it, I'm teaching children numbers. I teach the children how to recognize numbers, attaching a group of objects to a numeral, which is pretty much very similar to that phoneme to grapheme correspondence, isn't it? But then I don't stop there with mathematics. I teach the kids how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, all the process skills that are involved with mathematics. But yet we weren't doing that with English. But synthetic phonics is the way I see that comparison between the way we teach mathematics to now the way we teach children how to read and to spell. So we're going to teach children how to blend and segment using the alphabetic letter sounds. Now, when I talk about the alphabetic letter sounds, I'm not just talking about an A to Z system of phonics, of teaching the children that the A letter says I'm talking about the fact that we've got 26 letters of the alphabet, and those 26 letters can come together in some form to either create a digraph of two letters coming together to make one phoneme, coming together with three letters, so a trigraph coming together to represent a phoneme, four letters, a quadgraph, to represent that phoneme. And what about the split digraph? And then, of course, you've got those single letters of the alphabet. So we're looking at roughly about 43 to 44 phonemes in the English language. And our alphabetic system covers those 43 to 44 by putting them together in some way or on their own. So teaching children how to blend and segment using the alphabetic letter sounds, including those main digraphs as well. We want our children to have the alphabetic codes. What I mean by the alphabetic code is I've got this phoneme and I've got these representations with our graphemes to represent that phoneme. So the alphabetic code is taught before we expect children to read books. This is the difference for us using synthetic phonics, which is very different to analytic phonics. Analytic phonics, I gave my children the 100 words, those most frequently used words, and then straight away we got our children into those leveled books. And yet I had children that had no idea how to read these books. So now with synthetic phonics, it's the application of what I've taught with the part to whole and putting that into practice, into books, but I need to teach the children the alphabetic code first before I expect the children to open up a book and read that book. Phonemic awareness is key. I've always said it with synthetic phonics. If children are struggling with blending and segmenting, then I always say go back and see what children's phonemic awareness skills are like. If they are trying to blend a word, and I've got there as an example, cat on screen, and a child says cat, and they may say something like computer, then I know that phonemic awareness is an issue for them. And so I may need to go back and work with phonemic awareness, those phonemic awareness skills. So I need to make sure that with synthetic phonics, phonemic awareness is key so that children can hear all those phonemes in a word. They can blend those phonemes together to create that whole word. That's all part of that auditory training, as well as being able to pull a word apart and hear those individual phonemes in a word in order to eventually record it with that phoneme to grapheme correspondence, so spelling. And then within synthetic phonics, this is the one that's changed for us, and that's tricky words as well, because in the past, we've always given children lists and lists of sight words to learn by sight. But with tricky words within a synthetic phonics methodology, I'm looking at these tricky words, these irregular words, and saying to the children, what is it that's regular and what is it that's irregular? Yes, there may be a reason for that irregularity, so that etymology line for that particular word. But for a lot of our 5-year-olds, for instance, our 4.5 and 5, so those children at that foundation level, that etymology of that word sometimes can be overwhelming for them. So looking at just what makes that word tricky, what is it that's irregular in that word, to help them build that orthographic mapping of that word. So teaching children the tricky words and learning about what makes that word tricky, because then children, I find, can blend. And this is what I've done with my own children. If I'm looking at, say, the word said, and they go, and of course they say A because they know that the AI says A, and I'll say, oh, that's tricky. The AI is tricky in that word. It's actually saying an F phoneme. So I then can get the kids to blend. So they're practicing still. They're putting into place their blending strategy to attack these tricky words. So synthetic phonics is key. And this is so important. And this is where I feel that we're still at that crossover stage with using our readers. So with synthetic phonics, it's using decodable books first before we move into any other book that children need to have more of that initial code. They need to have a really good understanding of the code in order to read level books, in order to read any authentic book. So let's start with using decodable text so that we give our kids success when they're reading. And I've seen it. As soon as I bring out that decodable book, it contains phoneme graphing knowledge that has been taught, those children feel that huge level of success when they're reading. So start with decodable text in a synthetic phonics methodology. And once, as I said, once they've got a good command of the alphabetic code, then we can start to give children other books. And when I talk about other books, I'm not just talking about leveled readers. I'm talking about any book. Authentic text is what we're wanting our kids to be able to read. And blending is the first strategy for unknown words. So we're moving away from the cueing systems because we know that they don't work. And when I talk about those cueing systems, look at that first letter, and then for some children, for many children, they take a wild guess. Look at the picture. And for a lot of my kids who have English as a second language that I've dealt with, that I've taught for all my years of teaching, that picture may not be in their vocabulary of what that word is. And I'll never forget, there was a picture of a couch, and a child had no idea what the word couch. But of course, the word couch started with the C letter. So of course, this child said chair. Now, in the context of what that child was reading is right, but if I was doing a running record, I'd have to mark it wrong. So that word couch, given the fact that it could be segmented, it could be blended together to form that word, blending for us now is that first strategy. So the picture cues, that first letter, and the contextual cue, we no longer use within a synthetic phonics nature of teaching children how to read and write. So let's have a look at blending. What do I mean by blending? Blending simply is the skill of pushing phonemes together, and so they're our individual speech sounds. And when I talk about speech sounds, I talk about phonemes. And don't be scared to use phonemes with kids. I use phonemes, graphemes, split digraph. I use the correct terminology. And I always say, if children can name every Pokemon character and name every dinosaur that they have seen in books, then phonemes, graphemes, split digraphs are no different. As long as we teach the children the vocabulary, then it makes sense to them and they start to use their understanding of the phonemes to grapheme correspondence, the blending, all of that. They use it quite well. So blending is that process of pushing these phonemes, these speech sounds together to make a word. When we blend, we obviously can blend at an auditory level. So cat, I can blend that at an auditory level, but I can also then blend in print. But what the children are doing is that in here, they're still blending at an auditory level and making sense of that word in print. When I look at segmenting is the opposite. Let's go back to mathematics. I teach addition, I'll teach subtraction, multiplication, division. They all interact with each other. It's the same. You can't teach blending without segmenting. You need to do both together. So segmenting is the ability for children, for us as well, when we're trying to spell unknown words, and that's breaking up spoken words into the separate phonemes, into their separate sounds. Now, as children get better with segmenting words one syllable or one, and words with 2 to 3 to 4 phonemes, then we start to look at being able to segment at a syllabic level, so being where children can actually break up these longer words. So segmenting, when I'm looking at that phonological form of segmenting, it's segmenting at not just a phoneme level, but eventually also at that syllabic level so that children can spell multisyllabic words, but we've got to start at that base level. So segmenting is the ability to pull words apart into the individual speech sounds. Now, I'm just going to focus on one thing here with segmenting at speech sounds, at the individual phonemes, because as adults, when we segment, we tend to be more effective in the way that we segment. So we tend to, and I'll use the example of the word, truck, for instance. We tend to segment it as truck. So we'll actually create that blend, the consonant blend. But with children who are learning, you've got to break it up into the individual phoneme, because those blends can be quite difficult for our young students, and they tend to get mashed in together, don't they? When you think about how children tend to spell, and we've brought in a blend. So, for instance, the word such as truck, a lot of children will tend to hear the ch phoneme. So let's break up those blends into the individual phonemes to help our young students and as well as our struggling students. I know that there are some teachers here that are teaching in the older grades, in the primary grades. If you've got children that can't blend, break those words up into the individual phonemes. So even those consonant blends, break them up so that they can hear each individual sound. When I'm talking about decoding, so this is that fine line to blending. This is the process of lifting information from print. So for years, yes, we've had decoding, but for years, our decoding has been, well, I'm going to give you lists of words so that you can pull those words that I've taught you off the page. And through the picture, you're going to be able to lift that unknown word off the page, because that picture should be able to help you. But with decoding now in our curriculum at this stage, we're looking at being able to lift the information from the page, and for us in a synthetic phonics methodology, it is being able to blend to lift that word off the page, as well as obviously those tricky words that we're also teaching our students. So with blending and segmenting, they are not automatic skills. As I said, I was one of those early years teachers that, teacher that thought that I've taught the sounds, now you can blend. And what I found was that the children could tell me they were accurate in that phoneme to grapheme correspondence, but they could not push those sounds together. So if I had the word such as tip on the board, they would segment. They would try and blend it like this, tip. And that's all they would say. They would say the individual phonemes. They did not know how to push those sounds together. So it must be taught. And I always believe that, and I've seen it, and over all my years of teaching, that children who can orally blend tend to blend with ease. So children who, through their pre-foundation years, so whether it's preschool, whether it's kindergarten, I know states, countries call that stage before formal schooling starts differently. I really wish that phonemic awareness, phonological awareness was really focused there in that sector, because then once formal schooling comes along, then we can really move into blending and segmenting. But for a lot of our kids, from what I've seen, a lot of them don't come to school with a good grasp of phonological awareness skills. So we need to do that. So let's teach our kids how to blend and segment orally, as well as, in the meantime, teaching phoneme to grapheme, so that then we can push those sounds together and read words in print. So what are our goals, our decoding goals for grades 1 to 2? Well, I'd love my children to be able to blend single letter grapheme phoneme correspondences first. So that's my VC, so my vowel, consonant, my CVC words, CCVC. So those of you that are not sure, we've got the V as a vowel, the C as a consonant. So you can see here, it's 2 sounds to 3 sounds to 4 sounds in words. I also want my children to be able to blend and segment words containing the digraphs, so the consonant digraphs, the vowel digraphs, as well as the split digraphs. So for the split digraphs, for those of you that are not sure about the split digraph, we class it as the magic E, the bossy E. I've heard it called the fairy E. I've heard it called so many different ways. Let's be honest with the kids and call it its real name. It's a split digraph. And then obviously that application of blending when children are reading books, and the application of segmenting when children are creating text. Blend. And I put it there, blend, blend, blend. When teachers say to me, oh, I've done so much blending, I keep saying, no, you haven't. You haven't done enough. You need to do more, because I don't believe we do enough. And when you think about blending, children who are our bright students, they'll learn no matter which way. You can blend words with 3 to 4 sounds, but then if we then want to push them further, then we've got to teach them again how to actually tackle words that are longer, bigger words. So I don't believe we do enough of it. We need to do blending every day. So automaticity and fast read is so important. So I'm going to just give you some tips with blending and segmenting. So the first tip is, when you start to model blending, just when you've got enough phonemes to graphemes, and when I talk about enough, it's enough with 3. I know my sequence is s, at, ip, n. So after the first 3 phonemes, I can actually start blending. So as soon as I can, I start blending and segmenting. Do the same. As soon as you can, blend and segment. All right, my next tip. When you start to blend, make sure that your first phoneme is the loudest, and as you get to the end of the word, taper off and get softer. So for instance, it would be k, a, t. And the reason why I do that is because, especially for my struggling students, they're the ones that just need to get back, will hold on to that loudest sound. And if that last sound is your loudest sound, that's what they'll hold on to. And their blending is all over the place. You want them to get back to the beginning. So start loud and get softer as you get to the end so that they can make their way to the beginning of the word. Phoneme fingers. I've always loved phoneme fingers. It is visual. So I always get my children to segment words with their phoneme fingers. It provides a hook when children are trying to segment and when they're trying to record record the graphemes, especially for kids who struggle with English and don't have the vocabulary there for them. If they're trying to hear that first phoneme, a lot of children may not understand beginning, middle, end, initial sounds. For instance, what's the first sound? So having the phoneme fingers provides the visual and provides a hook. So phoneme fingers are great, and we use it. Currently, I am teaching a grade 1, grade 2 classroom of children, and phoneme fingers are part of my spelling every day. Tip 4, some methods just in case you've got some children who are struggling with blending. So the first is isolated blending. Then if children can't blend through isolated blending, I then move into final blending. If that's not working, then successive blending. So let's go into each one. Isolated blending. I find that children will do their blending, will blend through an isolated process. So I'm just going to do what they do, and it's k, a, t. So I start loud, get softer, but the isolated blending is that every phoneme is pronounced individually to produce that word. Now, if a child says computer or potato or even cap, I'm going to move. I'm not going to stick with this one. I'm going to go straight to this one. Now, what we do here is that we snap the first two together. So I'll go cat. So for a child that was able to blend the first two phonemes together and was not able to follow through, so may have said cap, for instance, then they need help here. And this is where I tend to start with some of those children when I've been listening to them read. So it becomes cat, so they can snap that last phoneme together with the first part. If this doesn't work, I go to this part here. Now, this here, it was is a strategy that a lot of teachers using reading recovery have used, and that's what we call successive blending. It's pretty much stretching a word in that continuous manner. A lot of research has come from here, and it's found that successive blending is the most successful. But what I would say is that when we're starting our phoneme to graphemes, you've got to look at your scope and sequence. And if you don't have a lot of successive, those continuous phonemes like s, all those continuous phonemes, then at the beginning of when you're teaching, you're starting out with phonics, then you will probably find that you're going to be doing isolated blending. But then when you've got some kids, after you've got quite a few phoneme graphemes up your sleeve, and you've got some kids that are having trouble with blending, then start to select what kind of words can I help this child to blend. And the ones that you're going to use are the ones where you've got the continuous phonemes, like your f and v and s. Right, so successive blending does have merit, but I do tend to start with isolated blending at the very beginning. Tip 5, once the children are blending orally, then encourage them to blend silently. So the robot voice is very powerful. Those of you in Australia knowing mini-lit, multi-lit, I'm not sure if it's moved out into other countries, but mini-lit, multi-lit uses this concept of the robot voice. So the robot voice, for instance, is verbalizing each of the phonemes. So, but once children can get the words and they're actually blending, then say to them, that robot voice is your inner voice. I don't want to hear your robot voice. I just want the whole word, because the ultimate goal with blending is to develop that fast read, the accuracy, so that we can then really move into comprehension when we're reading. It's part of that fluency. An activity that I love doing to help the kids create that inner voice. So I'll point to some of these letter sounds, so the graphemes, and the children will then say the phonemes in here in their mind and then tell me the whole word. So I might point to this, then this, then this, and hopefully the children will say chain. But I don't want to hear the phonemes. I want that process of the inner voice, so that all I get is the whole word, because I want fast read. I want automaticity with my students. Tip 6, as children begin to blend and segment words with 2 to 3, increase the level of difficulty. So a lot of these words, as we're moving up to 4 to 5 plus, will involve consonant blends and will also involve syllables. So really help the kids with the blending. Don't just think that because they can blend words with 2 to 3 that it's done and I don't need to push them any further. It's still going back to base level and helping them move to a harder level of blending words with more than 3 phonemes. I love to make sure that I am giving my children words obviously at their level. So these go home and the children practice in a voice so that all I get is that whole word. You'll see that from an early age, I am introducing morphology. So you can see words like ants and pins and pans and pats. It's not that I am introducing that word as a whole. So for instance, the children are trying to blend and s. I will go back to the base, and then they've got that understanding of that morphological unit of that plural suffix to help them understand and read the word and understand what that word means. So any word that you're starting to expand and you've got plurals in there, then go back to the base and build from the base word. And just before we finish up, the ability to master the skill of blending and segmenting, these 2 skills, it's very different for every child. I'll never forget, I had one child who took 12 months at that foundation year to learn blending, to blend and segment. So the best piece of advice is to persevere and don't feel that they can't do it, because for some children, that oral tuning might take a lot longer than some of the other kids that have just picked it up within the first few weeks of school. Some kids now, at the beginning of the school year, they've got it because they've just got that oral tuning, and some kids need that little bit longer to get these skills. Segmenting, I always find from experience, takes a little bit longer than the blending, so persevere. All right, any questions for me?
Santana, thank you so much. That was awesome. Yes, as Santana said, if anyone has a question, either type it in the chat or do you want to raise your hand on Teams? I'll sort of sift through, and anyone who might have a question, I'll take them off mute. But yeah, feel free to, I mean, if you guys just want to take yourselves off mute, you can just go for it whenever you'd like. Or raise your hand if you're feeling like you'd like to have a change and be a student for once. I know for me, Santana, I was a primary school teacher for years, and the thing that always got me was exactly as you sort of kept saying, which was that, you know, reading in general, but that particularly that blending and segmenting does not come naturally. It has to be taught explicitly. And I think that's such a key thing to really understand before we can actually go ahead and consider all of the teeny tiny little steps which are involved in ensuring the kids can actually blend and segment properly. And I love that you gave some really, really practical tips, some really sort of hands-on stuff that the teachers can apply in the classroom. That was great.
Thank you. It's all come from experience. I mean, as I said, I've been using synthetic phonics since 1996, and in a climate in education where phonics was taboo, and let alone a different type of methodology. So it's through a lot of trial and error that I've realised how important it is to explicitly teach these 2 skills.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have one question, Santina, in the chat. Someone has said, does this still apply after kids have had 6 or 7 years at school and still are not able to blend and segment? So I guess we're talking about intervention at that point.
Yeah. Look, you know, and that's a hard question to answer, because every, you know, there, with children who've got learning difficulties, for instance, you need to persevere and just keep going, because there are some kids I know in support units, for instance, they will just keep going with blending and segmenting, and a lot of these kids year after year will just need that exposure to the blending and segmenting strategies. So there are some with a story behind them, and I've also seen, and I don't want to, there are some kids that I've dealt with who've got who find it difficult to blend, and for them that sight word works for them. So it comes down to having that balance sometimes, because and as teachers we have that balance, because we've come from, now over the years we've come from systems where we've had whole language, we've had, now we're in a curriculum where it's synthetic phonics in our curriculum. There are some children, there's not many, but there are some that I've had to go back to, let's go through these words, let's learn them, but let's have a look at what's within the word, but you're going to learn these words off by heart. That's a hard question.
I guess that also sort of goes to outline the importance of having a really structured scope and sequence to ensure that there are no gaps, because especially when the teachers are changing year by year, if you have some teachers who are sort of operating off a different scope and sequence to the prior teacher the year before, then there's no telling what sort of phonemes that the students have and have not mastered. Santana, we've got another question sort of on that same topic as before. Someone has said, so what works best for dyslexic students?
Look, do you know, with children with dyslexia, they need to be shown how the pieces all fit together. And that's why I love synthetic phonics, because with synthetic phonics, it's the pieces of the puzzle that come together. So you've got your phonemes, your graphemes, and then you are putting these together to actually blend and segment. So there's a process for them, and from the experience that I've had, that synthetic phonics works really well for them because of that structure and the pieces of the puzzle, that it's not just, well, I'm going to show you a word by sight and you've got to learn it, because that's where they've had the issues, and especially with spelling, that they might be able to remember. If I'm looking at spelling, they might be able to remember a word, but they can't remember the order of the letters. Whereas with segmenting, they've got a process and they can hear the individual phonemes. Once they've got the phoneme grapheme correspondence, then they are able to segment a word and they're able to actually record the graphemes in the right order. So for children with dyslexia, synthetic phonics is key.
Okay, everyone, do we have any more questions or any more comments? I mean, we also love hearing any sort of feedback in the chat, or obviously you can shoot through an email afterwards. I've got one more here, Santina, that's just come through. Do children still need to learn sight words or break each part, e.g. said? So it's d.
Do you know, I had that conversation today with the school that I was training today, exactly that, because they've been so used to providing children lists and lists of sight words. With our tricky words, for instance, with those high frequency words, I remember when I first started teaching, and I was going through this synthetic phonics nature, but I didn't really understand it. I thought that there was a divide. I've got words that are regular and words that are irregular, and those irregular words, you just got to learn them off by heart, which was pretty much the old system of, here are 100 words that I'm going to give you slowly, but I'm going to give you these words. And it took one little student in my class 12 months to learn 5 of those tricky words, because I was doing them by sight. Whereas now, what we do is build that orthographic mapping, and Lenia Airy, who's she's a great researcher. She's done some wonderful research all on this whole concept of orthographic mapping, and that orthographic mapping enables children to associate a phoneme to a grapheme. Now, it's the same process with tricky words. Associate a phoneme to a grapheme, break it up, look at what's tricky, get the kids to blend it. Eventually, for some of our children, it might take, and that's why I say eventually, that will then become part of that memory bank in that orthographic processor, because we all have an orthographic processor in our brain, and that is where we can recall words by sight. But we've got to get to that level. And for some kids, for looking at tricky words and looking at what makes these words tricky. So yes, in short of that question, I would be looking at that word and saying the AI doesn't say A, it says E. Now, for my older students, I could go down that pathway of that etymology. Now, when I'm talking about older students, let me rephrase that. I've got a grade 1-2. I would be doing it with my grade 1-2 students and talking about the fact that the word said comes from the word to say. So, of course, it's got the A phoneme there. So with our students, depending on the level that you're teaching, you could go down that pathway of etymology, because we're actually looking at parts of a word, and by looking at parts of a word, we can actually get the kids to blend those words together, even though they're tricky and irregular, and have that ability to store that word in our brain for memory.
That's definitely such a complicated approach. And I think, what really stands out to me whenever we talk about this is exactly as you said, Santina, which is that every single student, in addition to all this stuff we're talking about, every single student also learns completely differently. So no doubt, as early years teachers, you guys have a lot on your plates. So you should be very proud of yourselves. And on that note, well done for spending your Wednesday afternoons at a webinar, doing even more learning. That is all the questions that we have, Santina. Was there anything else that you wanted to say to anyone, Santina, if you wanted to sort of have like a little send off before I close us off?
Oh, look, thank you so much for spending the afternoon, and have a wonderful, wonderful term. I know that the term at the start of the year always is hectic. So have a wonderful term, and I'd love to do some more webinars and perhaps see you again.
Yeah, fantastic. And for everyone who's been on the call today, you will all receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days, which has this recording so that you can go back and watch Santina's content again, which I will be doing. So there's so much in there, and it was all so valuable. And we'll also send you a few other little links. But as Santina said, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a fantastic evening. I will sign off now, but the call will remain open. So if anyone wants to jump in the chat, go for it. But otherwise, we will see you all another time. Thanks for joining.